By all means.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Please proceed.
So yes, I'm at the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and I focus my work on urban biodiversity and nature conservation. And it sounds a little bit of a lofty position, but I realised over the weekend that I actually have quite close historical ties with Westgate Park. And I'm going to show you a tiny snippet of what I found when I was digitising my family's videos or home movies from almost this date, Hannah pointed out, in 1993. My father worked at Corporate Haviland, and so this was where we played when we were waiting for him to finish work or when he had to do work on the weekends. And this is what Westgate Park looked like in 1993. Hardly the biodiversity superpower that it is today, but for us, that was our daily work. Nature, playing with the bin chickens, doing stuff, hanging out in the weeds. Yeah, it's obvious how much work has been done, and to me, this just shows the progress over time. Sites like this and the dedication that groups like this have put in, making these spaces great again, not just for people and kids to play, but also for So there's little old me getting my regular dose of ducks. My brother's got duck in the pond, and my sister's looking for binoculars for the park with it. So I might stop that one there. But what I like about this is that, you know, a lot of people in nature conservation, they have these amazing stories of, you know, houses that had beautiful bush blocks with koalas and blue-tongued lizards in the backyard. And that wasn't the case for me. That's not how I got in touch with nature. My nature was always around me in cities. And so I guess I started my research career really trying to highlight the value of nature conservation in urban environments, but also to show what we could do with it, how we could improve it. So I've called my talk Stuck in the City with You, and it's really about focusing on the kinds of nature that we have all around us. And most of my recent research was spurred by this quote that I saw in the draft of DELP's Protecting Victoria's Environment report that was in 2036. And basically they said, green infrastructure in the urban context, it might have limited value for biodiversity per se. It's great for connecting people with nature, but it's not that good for nature conservation. And this really annoyed me because it didn't hold true with the way that I saw nature conservation in Australian cities. But it's a really pervasive idea that nature in cities might be good for keeping us cool, or it might be good for sometimes connecting people with nature, but generally it's not a great place for conservation. And we tend to under-prioritize nature conservation in cities. So my work has really been an exercise in changing narratives and identifying opportunities and solving problems. So our response to that report was actually to do a bit of research and dig into the literature to see if the science actually supports this idea that nature conservation in cities is not a great idea. And we found that even the most recent ecological sorry, my toddler's just run past. Even the most recent ecological science doesn't support those old ideas, because in the past, we've looked at nature conservation as being for reserves that are far away from people and well protected, these really big, green, pristine spaces. But when it comes to nature conservation in cities, it's all about looking at spaces that would traditionally be overlooked by these older conservation practices. That includes novel and constructed ecosystems like Westgate Park, the benevolent matrix, so those spaces in between the big green spaces. Really small sites can actually pack a huge punch for supporting biodiversity and threatened species. And there are lots of things that we can do in urban environments by adding artificial structures, enhancing things beyond the reserve estate. And so we started this mission to kind of draw attention to the different ways that we can see and care for nature in cities. Another really big misconception that I've come up against in both my research and trying to get practice change is this idea that there's no valuable biodiversity in cities. So we traditionally think of valuable biodiversity as looking something like this: beautiful bandicoots and lush complex forests. And we see urban biodiversity as looking a little bit more like this: it's kangaroos punching on in the streets, bin chickens, or possums in our bedrooms. But there's more and more research showing that not only do cities support a really broad diversity of species, but they can be quite important for our rare and threatened species. And as part of my work under the previous Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, we produced this report which actually catalogued how many of our federally threatened species occur in cities and towns across Australia. And we tried to look at the kinds of opportunities that there were for their conservation. So what we did is we took maps of the urban boundary of 99 cities and towns across Australia, which is this black outline that you can see here. And we compared that with the species range maps, which is this tiny little red dot that you can see here in this case. And we found that there are 423 species that either have a historical or a current range across 99 of Australia's cities and towns. I think for the current range, it's about 360. Then there's about 50 odd that used to occur in these ranges, but have since gone locally extinct. And this covered a really wide range of species that surprised even us. And there was also a really wide range of overlap. So this species here is called Moresby's gum. It's a eucalypt that is only found in Hobart. Like, as you can see, its range is completely restricted to within the urban area. But then we have a broad range of other species. So we have ones like the magenta lily-pilly, and you can see all its little red patches are scattered up and down the coast. It occurs quite commonly outside of urban areas, but at least half of its range here is in this central coast of New South Wales, right in that urban heartland of expansion. So while it has quite a large range, a lot of that range is still occurring in an urban environment. You have ones like the greater bilby, which, let's face it, have hardly any of their range in an urban environment, maybe just the tiny edge of one species here. And then you have others like the swift parrot, which are occasional visitors to urban environments. So while their breeding grounds and strongholds are in Tasmania, during the off-season, they're up on our mainland coastlines, absolutely gorging themselves on gum trees and beautiful flowering plants in our cities and towns all up and down the coast. And it's something like at least 35 different cities and towns in Australia that the swift parrot uses for foraging before it migrates back to its breeding grounds in Tasmania. So there's a really wide different range of uses that threatened species find for cities. And so rather than catalogue threatened species as being either yes urban or no urban, we tried to be a bit more careful about how we categorise what the opportunities for their conservation looked like. So those that were urban restricted or highly urban, we decided that conservation action within cities and towns is an absolute must-have for these species. Then there are some that are only maybe moderately urban, and we can recognise and respond to opportunities that occur. They don't necessarily depend on urban conservation, but they can be a really great opportunity to engage people with species that otherwise they would never see. And then, of course, our historical species could be a really fantastic opportunity for bringing nature back, those reintroduction programs to try and put species back in landscapes that they traditionally belong. Another really exciting group of species that we found in this research were those urban restricted threatened species. And this is a group of 39 threatened species in Australia, when we said that cities are basically the last chance for their saviour. They don't occur anywhere else in the world, only in one, sometimes two Australian cities and towns. And they include a huge range of some of our most critically endangered orchids, beautiful acacias, a almost completely translucent snail that occurs in Hobart, and of course the wonderful western swamp tortoise. But our point here was trying to hit home, especially to the federal government, that we can't overlook cities as a space for conservation. If we want to be able to prevent the extinction of these species, and they've recently said they want to prevent the extinction of all species, then cities have to get a piece of that recognition. They have to get a piece of that action. We have to be able to do it in cities and towns as well. Another misconception that, let's face it, really annoys me, and something that I came up against a lot when presenting this research, was people would say to me, okay, great, all these threatened species live in city, that's fantastic. But let's face it, there's not much we can do about it. It's too hard to fix the problems that occur in cities. It's too expensive and it's too risky because it's probably not going to work anyway. And that is because they often see green spaces as looking a little bit like this. We have this fully concreted drain surrounded by industrial areas, fencing, weeds, clearing. And there's a whole host of problems going off here. And people just put it in the too hard basket, or somewhere that's too risky to invest their conservation dollar. So what we wanted to do at our research group was actually get a sense, well, what are the things that people are doing on the ground? Because we knew that research and science was way behind the practice. We knew we weren't going to get the answers from the scientific literature. So we actually conducted interviews with 27 urban land managers across Australia, from local and state government, non-government organisations and community groups. And we asked them, what are you actually doing on the ground to care for your environment? What actions are you taking for urban biodiversity? What are some of the barriers and solutions that you use to get stuff done? And the first thing that we learnt from that research was that, and probably not a surprise to anyone in this room, but community engagement is critical. And this has come up again and again and again, particularly in urban environments. The reliance on volunteers as a driving force for getting things happening on the ground is huge. We know it's prevalent in conservation across the board, but in urban environments in particular, it's a great opportunity because urban environments do have this powerhouse of millions of potentially engaged people that can work for conservation. And yet a lot of people are quite concerned about longevity, about burnout, about the weight that's put on a few champion individuals to help get things done on the ground. We also found that there was a real consistent desire to engage Indigenous perspectives and knowledge in urban conservation practice, but most of the people we were interviewed, they were quite unsure how to go about it. They often spoke about not being sure where to start or how to approach it appropriately. Or if they had tried in the past, they'd tried on way too short a timeline and not been able to turn it around within their deadlines. So what we did was actually collaborate with a consulting group called IndigiLab. They're an Indigenous-led company, and they reviewed the responses through our interviews and created this really great guide on Indigenous engagement for actions on biodiversity. And they kind of set out some steps that people can take and some guidance for how to go about bringing more of that traditional knowledge and representation into urban actions. The other thing that we were really excited about from talking to people was the enormous breadth of activities that have been undertaken for urban biodiversity across Australia. So there were 318 individual actions catalogued. We split them up into 9 categories, but I think what I really enjoyed was just how exciting most of these were. I mean, we spoke about a lot of the typical ones that come up. We plant things, we pull out the plants that we don't like, you know, pest control and things like that. But, you know, there are really ambitious projects to renaturalize previously concreted industrial waterways. There's projects for native streetscapes, cramming what would otherwise be considered really fragile native wildflowers in between a concrete wall and a concrete strip in busy city streets. There was some incredible work to engage communities. One of my favourites was the Hume City Council's Birds of Hume guide that helped their citizens, particularly migrant communities, really understand the new nature that was around them. And kids were using these guides to run around and tick birds off like they were chasing Pokemon. And even recycling habitat trees, which is a great project from Canberra. And what they've done is when a large dead tree has to be removed for safety reasons, they actually pick up and translocate the entire tree to a new location where it can be safely installed. It can still provide that habitat for hollow-dependent species, but it's concreted into the ground now, so it's not providing as much risk to communities that live nearby. We also spoke to people about not just what they were doing, but how they were getting it done, because we saw that as something that was particularly, well, potentially mysterious to a lot of people. Because many of the councils in particular that we spoke to, they said, we'd love to try something like this because we saw council so-and-so doing it, but we just don't know how they managed it because we always come up against these challenges. And I guess what you'd like to happen is a process a little bit like this, is a community of different minds come together and have a great idea, and then they put that great idea in the ground. But actually, what normally happens is they have a great idea and then they come up with 600 different reasons why that great idea can't work. It's too risky, the site's too degraded, your organisation doesn't support you, we don't have the resources, or there could be community conflict or disapproval or exclusion. So what we tried to do from looking at all the varied responses of the barriers and enablers that our interviewees gave us was map them out and figure out, well, how can we match up the things that people are doing to make stuff happen with the barriers that other people have faced, and provide some kind of pathways for people to either flick a switch and make that barrier go away, or find a detour, find a way to circumvent that barrier and get your action to happen. And we kind of organised them around these leverage points of project management, capacity, stakeholder values, and organisational support. And so we found that really, really important enablers were things like planning and coordination, partnerships with external funders. So if your organisation doesn't have the expertise or capacity, partnering with universities, with community groups, with organisations that happen to have a particular set of skills, as well as engaged communities, again, came up as being a really important enabler for helping things happen. And of course, we all understand that having organisational support, having a mandate that supports biodiversity conservation is really powerful in making sure that things get done. So following all this work, looking at the broader picture, I thought I'd also share 2 examples of how I'm putting those kinds of lessons into practice, because 2 of the things that I think I enjoyed most about the kinds of actions that we found were novel ideas for helping biodiversity in urban landscapes and engaging communities and citizens in biodiversity in their neighbourhoods. So the first one is with these handsome devils. They're powerful owls. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they're Australia's largest owl. It's probably one of the cool endangered species that you can find in Melbourne, but they face a bit of a housing crisis. So we have heaps and heaps of possums for them to eat. They're regularly seen, not just in the peri-urban areas of Melbourne, but right in the CBD, even on campus at the University of Melbourne. But they don't really breed in the city because there aren't enough of those large old hollows. The hollows they depend on are like a metre deep, which is an enormous structure to get up a tree. And any attempts that we've made so far to replace these hollows have not really been appreciated by the owls. There are no reports of them successfully raising young in a nest box. People have tried hoisting wheelie bins up into trees. They've tried really large recycled hollows. So far, nothing seems to work. And the size of the hollow that this bird needs and the urban setting makes it a really complex thing to design, because it has to be really heavy, because it has to be really large. So something like a recycled chainsaw hollow or a recycled hollow log, for example, might weigh 300 or 400 kilos that you've got to then hoist up into a tree. It's too hard to carve a chainsaw hollow into a tree large enough without completely destroying the tree. We need it to be safe for people to walk underneath. We don't want to damage the tree, and we need it to be easy to install. So it's kind of a tricky problem. And one way that we've tried to come up with new solutions is by collaborating with designers and architects. You know, they build bespoke houses for people, why not for wildlife as well? And so I co-supervise PhD student Dan Parker in the Melbourne School of Design. And basically, they looked at it from a completely different perspective. Instead of saying, okay, we've got to build a box, how do we make the box bigger and the hole bigger or slightly different to suit this owl? They start out by thinking, what does the owl need? What does a good natural owl hollow look like? And it has a rounded landing pad, it has a nice little feeding platform, and it has a nice rough interior for scratching, just as examples of the kinds of things that they look at. And what they then do is use very fancy and complicated design tools that I'd never heard of to actually recreate it from the owl's perspective rather than looking at building another timber box. So they laser scan the tree to find the exact right place to fit this design. They build some test modules that we put on the ground, and we can measure their internal temperature and make sure that they're not getting too hot before we hoist them up in the tree. And it basically, they've put together these modules of really light wooden Lego bricks, essentially, to build this more complicated structure that nestles perfectly into the branches of the tree. It just needs this rubber harness here to hold it in place. Doesn't need any screws, it weighs about a quarter of what a natural hollow would. We know that it has good thermal properties. And the idea is that it's large enough, light enough, and the right design that it might actually be better for the species that we're designing for. We're in the middle of evaluating these hollows. I think we've had a bunch installed out in Knox, and there's a couple on campus at the University of Melbourne. We know that they've been owls have actually been in the same area, and we know that they've been used by galahs and ringtail possums and some lorikeets as well. But what I like about their approach as well is they're thinking about the whole life cycle of these structures and all the different stakeholders that are involved in getting them to happen. They want to make it easy for practitioners to install them. They want to make it safe for people to be able to walk under them, and safe for the trees. You know, city trees are pretty rare themselves. We want to make sure that they're also not damaged by the conservation actions that we're doing to enhance them. And they're looking at longevity and recyclable materials. It's a really exciting new way of approaching some tricky problems that we haven't solved yet. The last project I'll talk about really quickly, because some of you might be familiar with it, is the Superb City Wrens project. And this is a collaboration between myself, BirdLife Australia, RMIT, and the City of Melbourne. And it's basically a mission to get more fairy wrens in more places in the city. Because at Royal Park, we have an issue where we have fairy wrens, but only in this tiny little corner. So the City of Melbourne have decided, well, can we do some planting works and habitat restoration that will create corridors and more suitable habitat so that the fairy wrens can spread throughout the park. And then maybe they'll be able to spread further into the matrix, and then we could have citywide fairy wren dominion. What we've done is we've banded 55 of the fairy wrens that live in that corner of Royal Park before these habitat restoration works have really taken place. The idea is we'll be able to track the movement of these individuals over time and throughout space, and hopefully see not just are we getting fairy wrens pop up in places we didn't see them before, but are we getting those fairy wrens from that corner? Have they been able to use these places as corridors to move and spread throughout the park the way that we intended? And so you can see these tiny little leg bands that we've got on fairy wrens here that were put on by the experts at BirdLife Australia. I am not allowed to touch fairy wrens. They are far too small and delicate for my very clumsy hands. But the benefit of having these individually banded birds is we can engage citizen scientists to help us monitor that. And I think that's a really powerful way to go about nature in cities, because it brings people in, it brings communities in, and it draws attention to really special species that they might otherwise overlook. We've been promoting the hell out of it over the last couple of weeks. And if you haven't seen it or been involved, please do check out our Superb City Wrens website to learn more. But we're hoping to really track some amazing change over the next couple of years. So the next challenge that I'm working on is looking at mapping urban environments and what does biodiversity values in cities look like. because all of these projects depend on understanding what the landscape looks like now and then deciding what actions we're going to do and where. But the current approaches to mapping biodiversity value in cities, in Melbourne, for example, are to look at things like, well, where is all the intact vegetation? Where are all the really important ecological vegetation communities and the threatened species and large green spaces? And that really overlooks a huge chunk of the land that actually supports biodiversity. It completely overlooks the matrix. It overlooks anything that wasn't here in that exact pristine condition before European colonisation. And so if we want to have future initiatives for bringing nature back to cities or having biodiversity positive development and support restoration projects, we really need maps that better reflect what the ground looks like. Because at the moment, I think maps of biodiversity value completely overlook novel and restored spaces, or those spaces in between that we know are so important for supporting nature. And so my takeaway there is, if we rely on a very limited view of what constitutes biodiversity value, our ability to enhance urban environments is always going to be constrained, because we're always going to think, well, there's not enough there. So that's all from me. That's my little spiel, is that we can and must get better at sharing urban habitats, because we know that it's great for people. We know that 90% of Australians live in cities, and we know the extraordinary biodiversity that cities support and could support, because we make cities the way that they are. We could make them differently so that we can better share them with nature. You can find me at all those locations, and I'm happy to take any questions now or another time. Thank you.
Lynn, you're just on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry about that. Kylie, we'd love to take you up on your offer to answer some questions from our audience tonight. So can you do some thinking, those people who would like to put some questions, and maybe put your hand up if you've got a question, and we'll come to you if that works well for you. Maybe I'll start with a more general question, Kylie, about Westgate Park. That's our focus, of course. What is it you think that we could work on from what you've told us tonight? Is there, this is maybe an unfair question because you're perhaps not as familiar with what's been done at Westgate Park, but do you have any advice for us or any suggestions to make about what you've just said?
I would just continue to shout your work from the rooftops. I mean, places like Westgate Park to me are they're the kind of story that people need to hear and understand about urban conservation. The story of how Westgate Park came to be the way that it is. I think a lot of people today don't appreciate the extraordinary effort that went from turning that from a, industrial drainage ditch into what's now a really significant wetland for biodiversity. I think one of the challenges that you'll probably continue to face, and I think all urban parks will face more in future, is managing that interplay between how people want to use the space and maintaining certain biodiversity values. I think especially during COVID lockdowns, a lot of green spaces came up against this difficulty of, or firstly, not being able to be maintained in the way that they need to. Look, we couldn't get into weed, we couldn't get into do those sorts of things. But people are suddenly turning to green space within their 5 or 10 kilometres and, using it however they wanted, which wasn't always in line with the way the park manages. So I think that kind of human nature conflict, which is not a phrase I particularly like, but I can't think of a better way to word it, is going to be one of the harder challenges. But in terms of what Westgate Park's been able to achieve, I think a lot of people could stand to to learn from that.
All right, thank you. Janet.
Thanks for a fantastic talk, Kylie. I was just wondering what opportunities exist to connect Royal Park with Westgate Park along a biodiversity corridor.
Yeah, we're looking into that at the moment. So some connectivity mapping that we did for the City of Melbourne a little while back sort of showed the importance of those, those three big parks. There's, Westgate, Royal Park, and the Gardens. We know that the fairy wrens, there's fairy wrens in Westgate Park, if I'm not going insane. And we know that they're moving up and down Moonee Ponds Creek, for example. So, some of the people doing surveys for us have actually suggested that we expand and include sites in places like Stony Creek Backwash and all of these other little green spots in between to see, at what point in the urban matrix are particular species dropping out and where can we build those corridors. And sometimes I'm not sure how much the need is a specific green corridor versus a range of stepping stones in smaller places that allow, those sort of small safe havens that are embedded within the matrix along the way. But I think there's not just opportunity, but need. I think we need to get better at softening those in-between spaces so that we're not just relying, or we're not forcing nature to rely on just three great big patches in what's otherwise an enormous city.
Thank you. Angelo. You're still on mute.
Here we are, unmute. Kylie, the question is regarding how well do you think councils are doing to promote these wild places as opposed to gardens? Because they're very good at gardens, but they're slowly changing to something more wild for biodiversity.
It's patchy. So my experience of councils has been similar to that of, individual parks and community groups. There are some absolute champions that are leading the way, some that are incredibly well funded and some that are doing it, really tough and off the back of their own dedication. And then there are some that just have zero interest at the moment. I think that tide is turning, and I think councils in particular do a lot of looking at what other people are doing. And once they see that it's worked for another council, and not just worked in that it's promoted biodiversity, but in that their constituents didn't write 600 angry letters to the editor and the councillors didn't all lose their job because of the action. Once they realise it's politically safe to do as well, then they start being like, well, I'd like my own green line, or, I'd like some other exciting new thing so that the Lord Mayor can get on the television. So I think it's slowly changing, but it's definitely patchy. We called it, I think, pockets of best practice, where some are really doing the work to figure out what works and to make those hard mistakes, to try something and have it fail and have the community yell at them, but then try again and have it work. I think that takes real bravery and ambition, and not everyone's there yet.
Thanks, Kylie. George, did you have a question?
No, I was just clearing my throat. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right, good. I can't see any other hands up. So if you have a question, thanks, Rod. Introduce yourself first, perhaps.
Kylie and I have met this evening. I guess I haven't met other people here. I am the current manager of Billy Nursery. Kylie, do you have programs or students running biodiversity projects at the moment?
I've just had one finish, but our research group, I think, is always looking for people in the urban biodiversity space. So I work really closely with Nick Williams at the Green Infrastructure Research Group. And, I think this is just an area that's going to keep growing, which is really exciting for us. A lot of researchers realized during COVID that they kind of had to look in their local environments. And now that they have, they're like, oh, there's some really interesting things in here. And I was like, yes, there are some very interesting things going on in here. But yeah, there are definitely programs at University of Melbourne that can direct student volunteers, for example, or students to conduct specific research projects, particularly in places like Westgate Park that I think already have incredible underlying data sets.
I'd also like to offer the expertise of the staff. Seed collection for anybody who's looking to do a project. So we're more than happy to be in contact with people.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, I'd love to get in touch and make some connections there. And I think I should also point out that all the resources that I mentioned are publicly available, but I'm happy to provide them in an easier to read or access email with all of those attached if you would like them.
And I would just add that Kylie, we've already been in conversation with Kylie a bit about opportunities to collaborate on interesting research that could feed back particularly into park management or help make the case for the kind of investment that we make in biodiversity in the park elsewhere in Melbourne. So that's an open discussion that hopefully will lead to some really nice stuff.
Can I just ask a quick question of you, Kylie, around mapping? Would it be useful for us to regularly record our plants and our other species that occur in the park? And do you use iNaturalist? And is that helpful in, I recognise that it's volunteers who do it, so it's not the same kind of research as perhaps you do, but what would you like to see happen to that sort of data recording?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Firstly, I love iNaturalist. I use it personally and professionally. Secondly, I think one of the problems or one of the challenges for getting a more comprehensive understanding of biodiversity across a city is that information is so siloed. So you might look at something like iNaturalist and go, oh, no one's ever surveyed here, but there's a community group that have done surveys there every year since the dawn of time. And then they know every inch of that place backwards.
Like the bird survey group.
Yeah, for example. And, or there are different, biodiversity doesn't respect or respond to any kind of political or land tenure boundaries, but that is how we map and measure and store knowledge about cities at the moment. So, you might have information that goes right up to here and then it stops because that's the boundary where the City of Melbourne ends, and now it's from here on, it's actually Melbourne Water's responsibility, and there's no place we can get both of those bits of information at once. So that's something we're grappling with at the moment, is if we were to try and create a publicly available resource that maps biodiversity across the city in a way that can guide practice, what would that look like, and what would we need to include in that to be useful, ignoring how difficult it might be to actually compile the underlying data. But yeah, I'm not sure of the answer to that yet. It's something that I'm still grappling with, but, I'm aware there are just, even consultants' reports, a consultant might do a report of a particular patch before a development goes through, and then that stays on a shelf somewhere. And that's important knowledge about, well, maybe biodiversity that was there before the development went through, but that's important information that doesn't really see the light of day or isn't shareable. So, how we get a better picture of what cities look like as habitats instead of a city that has habitats within it in those green patches, I think is a way, it's as much about a change in the way we think as the way we share information.
Mm-hmm. Very good. That's been fantastic. Thank you so much. Unless there's anybody else with a hand up to ask a question, we'll let you go and look after your toddlers. And we're having recorded this, we'll put it on the website to see if there's interest there, but I'm sure there will be, and it'll be good for us to go through it in more detail as we go forward.
Thank you so much for having me. And I can share that I'll make that video of Westgate Park available to you as well, if you want to peruse the old times of Westgate Park in the 90s.
With all those terrible ibis.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kylie.